Dr. McCormick mentioned a little bit about my interest in radiation, and certainly that's been a big area of my career, ionizing radiation. Through my work at the CDC post 9/11, there was a lot of focus on chemical as well as radiological hazards, and my specific area of contribution to the CDC at the time were primarily related to radiation. And that said, although my primary area had been radiation, there's no way you can be a medical toxicologist without learning and becoming a subject matter expert in chemical hazards as well. And so I was an advanced hazmat life support instructor, teacher, and certainly assess, evaluate, diagnose, and manage chemical exposures through my clinical practice and area of expertise. But I never imagined that I would actually start being consulted on these topics that I've learned about during my fellowship related to chemical warfare agents. You know, in 2010, 2011, 2012, I was already at Emory working a lot on radiation issues. But just being Lebanese, I think being Lebanese, fluent in Arabic, and being at the time the treasurer of the Middle East North Africa Toxicology Association, I became involved in these videos that were being circulated on YouTube, and I became involved through Syrian colleagues that were concerned about what they were seeing in their home. And they were asking me, could this be a chemical exposure? And one simple trick for those of you who are in the audience today here with no specific expertise in this area is to look at someone who's sick, obviously critically sick, without any signs of trauma after a bombing. That must give you a hint there's another exposure here on top of the traumatic exposure. This exposure is either a chemical, a biological agent, or radiological agent. And typically, we all know that the radiological agent is going to be slow in its appearance, typically with the signs and symptoms. You're left with the chemical and biological, and certainly the most rapidly acting is going to be the chemical, or a toxin-mediated illness. So my answer to that was yes, it is likely a chemical exposure at the time. It was really the early days, the first couple of attacks, and we were literally reading transcripts in Arabic written by responders on the battlefield, and they were asking for help. I mean, the first thing I did in this area was translate the Georgia Poison Center management guidelines for nerve agents into Arabic, and I direct the international program, and I have at any time 3 or 4 Arabic-speaking physicians. Currently, I have Saudis and Omanis, and they actually translated that in an hour, and we sent it to the battlefield so that these responders have some information to use in Arabic. Unfortunately, these sad events are no longer, you know, subject to guessing or is this a chemical attack. It is now even published in the literature, and Dr. Arthur had shared with me this recent publication about sulfur mustard. So now it's in the peer-reviewed literature. So it's no longer a YouTube video. It's in the center of our literature, and this needs to wake us up, and we need to push the science and the management of these hazards because they are no longer a possibility, they are a reality, unfortunately. They're also a reality because these chemical agents that are very toxic are not a new player in our environment. They have not just been discovered 10 years ago. These have been discovered decades ago, and we have actually disposed many of these chemicals after the war ended, for example, World War I. We disposed of them in various ways. One of them was in the ocean. The other one was burying them on the ground. And you are not a stranger. Alabama is not a stranger to chemical weapons. Alabama is an important state in terms of the chemical weapon research and storage that we had in Anniston, where Shannon lives. And we've destroyed the stockpile at Anniston. However, there are buried stockpiles as well in Huntsville at the Redstone Arsenal, and these are not without risk. There are many cases in the literature published and in the informal literature where they describe people, innocent bystanders, getting exposed to these chemicals, whether it's a fisherman pulling out a small shell from World War I that was dumped across from the New Jersey shore, got exposed to it, developed a little mosquito bite-looking lesion, thought to be a mosquito bite initially, misdiagnosed, and then was properly diagnosed as a mustard exposure. This is why education of healthcare providers is paramount in our research education core at this Center for Excellence. So these can happen. You can actually also dig somewhere, a construction site, and potentially dig out, without knowing, a chemical weapon that is buried in your environment. And these are not very well mapped. We don't know where every single one is buried. And this can happen, and it has happened. This is a paper actually from China that is kind of disastrous, actually. They were building a parking lot underground, and they found 5 drums left behind from World War II. The Japanese used a mixture of mustard and Lewisite at the time against the Chinese. And you see the barrel is decomposed, it deteriorates, the metal deteriorates, and the liquid leaks out. And it persists for a long time and can still expose people. And this is in 2003, so 50 years later. And now you have 44 victims, 1 death, 17 days after the exposure. This is a significant hazard, as you can see from this specific example. And this specific paper was talking about the long-term complications. So there are also long-term complications associated with these accidental exposures. So certainly for us today, being members of the UAB community, the research community, the medical community, this should be a core knowledge for us. Chemical agents should be a core knowledge for us because of who we are, what Alabama is, our risk in Alabama, and our particular expertise that we have in your research course, which is also unique. And this is why the NIH gave you this highly coveted award, because of what you have at UAB. And certainly the research education core should expand the mission to the providers and other aspects and other parts of the university to really be at cutting edge of the whole chain from bench to practice. So therefore today I'm going to give you an overview of these chemical incidents with a particular focus on the arsenicals, which is a focus of your center, and discuss some of the challenges that we have as medical providers in tackling these hazards. So a chemical agent really at first, in my opinion, is any chemical around you. It doesn't have to be an arsenical, it doesn't have to be a cyanide or a nerve agent. Think of chemical weapons as any chemical, or chemical warfare agents as any chemical that can affect the health of individuals. And many chemicals do that. It just depends on how much you are exposed to. As Paracelsus would say, what defines a poison is the dose. Everything is a poison. If you drink too much water, you can get hyponatremia and you can get sick. Even water can be a poison. Therefore, any chemical around us can be poisonous. Of course, our chemicals that we're talking about today, the chemical warfare agents, have specific physical properties, has specific chemical properties and mechanistic properties that make them very potent, very effective in entering the body and damaging the organs. This is why they are used in warfare, because of their toxicity. Now, these agents have been used for many decades. They were really brought to us as an important weapon, I think, around World War I. Initially, what they used were the tear gas chemicals. These tear gas chemicals as irritants were the first experimentation that occurred. But really, the main incident that people quote, if you go and ask people to tell you when was the first time a chemical weapon was used, most people would tell you it was in Belgium. It was in Belgium during the second battle at Ypres, Belgium. And that was in April 22nd, 1915. The Germans at the time released from cylinders 160 tons of chlorine. This is what they were using. Chlorine was commonly used in Germany. It was not an exotic chemical. It was commonly used in multiple different industries. They had plenty of it, and they released it. And you see, when they did that, they had such a great response that they did not know how to make that to their advantage. They did not have the plan to go and take over the enemy lines. They breached the enemy lines, but they couldn't really take over the battlefield. And of course, with these rudimentary ways to release the chemical from cylinders, the wind direction can affect your soldiers as well. And people say that this is why Adolf Hitler, who was a soldier in World War I, was potentially exposed to chemicals and did not want to use them in World War II. Although Adolf Hitler had them weaponized in North Africa and Eastern Europe, he had nerve agents. Had he used those, God forbid, we would have potentially changed the outcome of the war, because at the time we were not ready for these nerve agents being used in the battlefield. Now, around that same period, scientists were realizing that chlorine was not the best. They started thinking about other chemicals like phosgene, which is same, it's an irritant with a more delayed onset of action because it's less water soluble. When you're less water soluble, you hydrolyze slowly. And when you hydrolyze slowly, you release the hydrogen plus ion slowly. And that's what causes the damage to the cells and the symptoms. So you get to inhale the phosgene without stopping your breath, without holding your breath. It enters your lung, and there in your lung it hydrolyzes and causes your pulmonary edema. Chlorine, on the other hand, has an intermediate water solubility, and the hydrolysis is faster, so it hits you in the eye and the nose and the throat. So you stop breathing and you cover your eyes and you run away, and you don't get a higher dose of exposure. But even phosgene was difficult to use, and they tried with other things. The French tried with cyanide compounds and still did not find what was satisfactory to them. Other researchers discovered the sulfur mustard agent, which was the next one I'm going to talk about, as well as Adamsite. And Adamsite is particularly important to you today because Adamsite is actually called a vomiting gas. It is an arsenical. Adamsite that Dr. Attar mentioned initially is DM. It's referred to as DM. It's one of three arsenicals under that category. There's DM, there's DC, and DA. Those are called vomiting agents, although vomiting is not necessarily their main effect. Their main effect is irritation. They actually irritate the upper airway, the eyes, the throat. They can affect the lungs. And the couple of deaths reported were from accidental exposures that really affected the lungs and caused pulmonary edema, pneumonia, sepsis, and death. And this is what I think what explains why you in your research center course, you have the lung, the skin, and the kidney. This is not a haphazard thing. This is planned to respond to the toxicities of these arsenical compounds. The other interesting about Adamsite is the delay in its effect. So if you're a soldier and you get exposed to Adamsite, you don't immediately know it. So a few minutes later, you start getting the irritation. So you got 2 or 3, 4, 5 minutes where you're actually still breathing and getting exposed in a more prolonged manner. And the other thing that's interesting about the Adamsite is that it can also cause systemic effects, whether it's CNS depression, fatigue. It can also cause, like I said, the gastrointestinal symptoms, including vomiting and diarrhea. So that's important to see what we can do to better understand the mechanism of actions of these agents that could be manufactured by terrorists, that could be used by rogue nations in a battlefield. The king of World War I, on the other hand, was mustard, sulfur mustard. This was also a chemical that was discovered around that time and used in 1917. This sulfur mustard is the king of World War I because it caused the largest number of casualties. And also it affects the skin, the eyes, and the lungs. Primarily here, some pictures of Iranian casualties exposed by Iraq. And you see the erythema over the chest and the blisters over the back, and the effects on the eye. The interesting thing about mustard is that the mortality is not very high. So in multiple studies or reports of the literature, it's usually less than 5%. So it's not really a big killer of military troops. It's more an incapacitating of the military troops because they now cannot fight. The illness really lasts several days. It's delayed in its onset and lasts several days, and during that time, the soldiers are out of function. And those that die usually die after a couple, 2 or 3 weeks, so they also consume a lot of your hospital resources. And as a toxicologist, we always look at the physical properties of chemicals. It's particularly important to do that with mustard, because mustard is going to vary in its clinical effects depending on the ambient temperature. Now, it is a liquid and it's persistent in the environment, but if the temperature is hot in the environment, it will vaporize more, and that will lead to more respiratory pulmonary exposures. And we saw that in Iran, where in the Middle East, where it's hotter than in Europe, for example, and we had more people getting pulmonary complaints compared to what we saw in World War I. Also, anecdotally, in World War I, people would have exposures to the mustard in the morning as well. So basically, the shelling would happen at night, let's say the shells fall at night, people get exposed to it that way, and they put on their masks. In the morning, when they wake up and the shelling has stopped, they would take off their mask, right? Unknowingly, the temperature in the morning is warmer than at night. So whatever was still on the battleground will vaporize and expose them that way. So the troops started keeping their mask for 3 hours in the morning, and not just removing their mask in the morning after the shelling has ended. So that's a little interesting factoid about mustard and the effect of ambient temperature. Also, because of its high freezing point, countries like Russia or Japan wanted to mix it up with something else, with another solvent, another chemical. And for example, in Japan and Russia, they've mixed it up with Lewisite, another notorious arsenical that we will discuss in a little bit. So that's a mixture of these two compounds just to make it more usable at these different ambient temperatures. So Lewisite also was discovered and produced in that era by Captain Lewis, who actually recognized another scientist who was developing it as part of a thesis, and realized that could be used for chemical warfare. Lewisite was made with lessons learned from mustard, right? So there were some lessons learned from the sulfur mustard pros and cons. Lewisite was meant to maybe improve the efficacy of sulfur mustard, or the properties of sulfur mustard for a chemical warfare attack. Primarily, they wanted to cause symptoms immediately, rapidly. They want to have pain that is immediate, not delayed. I've actually consulted, I told that to Dr. Arthur, on a small cluster of sulfur mustard exposures in Eastern Europe or former Soviet Union Republic. And these cases developed the blisters several hours later. Basically, they were exposed to the chemical, and maybe 8-10 hours later, they showed up to the hospital with these exposure, with these small blisters. So that's delayed. And also their eyes started tearing and they started burning several hours later. So Lewisite is supposed to be more rapidly acting. But again, it will affect also the lungs, the eyes, and the skin, and causes a fluid-filled blister like mustard. Lewisite supposedly smells like geranium, and that will lead to another interesting fact that I will tell you about in a few slides. Lewisite missed the party, the World War I. Lewisite was shipped to participate in World War I, but en route, the World War I ended, and there was no need to use it in World War I. So it was dumped in the ocean, like I told you initially when we were talking about the hazards around us from these chemicals. The other interesting thing about Lewisite is that the British in Oxford University manufactured an antidote for it called British anti-Lewisite. The problem with this antidote is that it is actually effective for skin and eye injuries, but must be applied on the actual area of exposure within minutes. So this is quite challenging when you develop a countermeasure, when you have to decide whether it's a good candidate for clinical use. You have to take into consideration the time window where your countermeasure is efficacious compared with the time window where the chemical is noxious to the body and the organs. So you have to try to match these two together, and every scientist will go through that process when going through multiple candidate chemicals that can be used as antidotes. Now, the soldiers were being exposed to these chemicals, they were getting injured to these chemicals, and these are valuable resources, so the military started experimenting with personal protective equipment, PPE. And this PPE slide is just kind of on a lighter note, just to show you these vintage PPEs that were used at the time. They were even putting these PPE on animals like horses or mules, because those are also important part of the team of the military troops in World War I. Now, when World War I ended, we were able to complete many meeting agreements about forbidding the use of chemical weapons. These had started in the 1800s, but really the main date was in 1925, and Geneva Protocol was signed, where you had 28 countries, including the United States, condemning the use of gas and bacteria in warfare. Unfortunately, that was not a very efficacious or a uniformly efficacious deterrent to countries to use chemicals, and they have. They have used in different parts of the world, for example, in Italy at the time against Abyssinia, which was Ethiopia at the time. They used mustard that was thrown out of planes. There was also an incident in Bari where the U.S. military had a ship called USS John Harvey, was carrying a large number of mustard bombs, was docked in Bari for World War II, and then it was bombed by the Germans or the Italians, the fascists at the time. I don't remember who actually bombed them, but that led to 617 US mustard casualties with 83 deaths. This was in Italy. And some of the people that lived in Bari also became exposed because the fire burned the mustard and people were exposed to the fumes as well. Japan used mustard, reportedly, hydrogen cyanide against China and possibly Lewisite as well between 1937 and 1944. And at the same time, the German scientist Gerhard Schroeder discovered nerve agents. These are a different class of chemicals that we will not dwell too much about today, but these are your organophosphate pesticides, your German agent A, Teben, the first one discovered. The second one was GB, which was Sarin, GD, which is Soman. And now we have several ones, and we have even fourth generation nerve agents like the Novichok that we saw being used in the UK. Also, that period was marked by the Operation Geranium. I told you about geranium earlier. What smells like geranium? Your Lewisite was also dumped at the time by the US military, preceded by a dump across from the coast of South Carolina and Charleston. So again, these are certainly hazards for fishermen, and these shells can still be a hazard because they contain active chemicals. Another arsenical that was introduced for the Vietnam War as a herbicide, really to defoliate the tree line, was Asian blue. That's also an arsenical, and we don't know much about its acute health effects as far as clinical reports, but we are concerned about cancer, for example, and the International Agency for Research on Cancer classifies it as a possible carcinogen and classifies it as a 2B carcinogen. Now, fast forward to the 80s, Iraq, in conflict with Iran, and the Iraqi Kurds used mustard as well, sulfur mustard, amongst other chemicals and other bacteriological agents, and caused thousands of casualties amongst Iranian troops. And that was certainly a significant use of this chemical warfare in modern history. The first time we saw use by a terrorist group was in Japan. Shoko Asahara, which is the gentleman on the criminal on the left side of the slide, was born half-blind and became a spiritual leader, created his own cult called the Aum Shinrikyo cult, and was trying to influence the politics and was trying to evade the judicial system at times, and used chemicals numerous times to either kill his adversaries and or scare them. They've used VX, which is a nerve agent. They've used anthrax spores. They even tried to get some Ebola virus from Congo during one of their missionary missions to assist in an Ebola outbreak. And finally, it culminated in 94 and in 95. In Matsumoto in 94 and in Tokyo in 95, so 9 months later, they've released sarin. Of course, fast forward, the tragic events in Syria are worth underlining here and pausing on a little bit. The horrific use of chemical weapons that started with nerve agents in Syria is well documented by the Syrian Arab Medical Society, a nonprofit organization that's published this report that's available for you to download online. And you see the number of deaths from these chemical exposures, 1,500 deaths. Quite significant, widespread in Syria. And what I would like you to point your attention to is that it was sarin and it was also mustard. Fast forward to March 19, 2013 in Khan Al-Assal, where nerve agents were used, and a physician who actually now lives in the US is attending a residency program in the US, published this report of their experience with these 20 people that were killed and 124 injuries at their hospital. He discussed the importance of knowledge, the lack of knowledge resources, the knowledge of training, the lack of PPE, the lack of antidotes, and how they struggled to deal with that. Now, this was only a prelude, unfortunately, to an extremely tragic event a few months later in August, where more than 1,300 deaths, many children died that day in this attack on rural Damascus that led to a significant response from the international community and led to the Syrians signing the OPCW assessment release, letting the OPCW to go into Syria and investigate and the destruction of their arsenal. Unfortunately, although they stopped using sarin reportedly and mustard, they started using pulmonary irritants like chlorine. And the second part of that war, we saw chlorine attacks on civilians. And this is one of my cases in Georgia, actually. It just shows you what a irritant like chlorine can do to the lungs. This is a patient that was exposed to zinc chloride, which can release hydrochloric acid after exposure to humidity, and led to this severe ARDS, bilateral pneumomediastinums, pneumothoraces and pneumomediastinum, and 23 days being intubated at an ICU in Atlanta. So again, Syria is certainly a mark of shame on us, because this is something that occurred a number of times, and our response as an international community has definitely been suboptimal. Not only in terrorism we have to be worried, also in criminal acts. This is a crime that happened in Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, where a person was assassinated with a nerve agent called VX. So that was followed by another perplexing event in March. I was actually in Oman at the time at the Minatox conference, and this occurred in Salisbury, England, where a former spy, Sergei Skripal, was entertaining his daughter who came to visit him from Moscow. They did quite a bit of things that afternoon, from lunch to pub to different activities, and finally they were found sick at the bench in the park. They had a cholinergic toxidrome with vomiting and seizures and were taken to the hospital. What concerned me about this event here, that this was not necessarily the bread and butter nerve agent, and was apparently a new type of nerve agent called Novichok or Nubi that we don't know much about actually. So we're trying to get some information about this chemical just by looking at what happened and what's available in the media, really. That's our sole source of information at this time. This lady, Dawn Sturgess, received a gift from her boyfriend, Charles Rowley. Charles Rowley was interested in finding items in trash cans, and use them, like some people throw things in the trash can that he may put to use. He found a nice bottle of perfume in there, and he offered it to his girlfriend, and he helped her open the perfume vial, so he got a little bit sick, but then she actually put some on her wrist and did this specific movement that my wife does when she tries a perfume, and that got her really sick. Also, I want to remind you that the police officer that investigated this incident went to Skripal's home hours later, and then maybe just by opening the door handle, got exposed to the Novichok and got sick, was in the ICU for several days or weeks to receive treatment. So this agent is certainly concerning as well. We don't know much about it. It's thought to be called Novichok. It's thought to cause the same effects as a nerve agent. But again, I bring you this example to remind you that chemical weapons can be very potent, very toxic, can persist for a long time, and can be a hazard to responders, even after a prolonged period. This is why we need to have the knowledge and we need to have the science to support our development of diagnostic tools and countermeasures to treat these, because they can occur, and if they do, we have little to fight them. So the challenges, again, start from the storage and production facilities. We have to remember that these chemicals must be secured physically. We must have systems in place to track them, to have an inventory, think about precursors, and think about who has access to these chemicals. We should also enhance that wherever we can, from the production chain to the actual end area of use. Our responders have huge tasks to deal with, because our responders need to be able to enter the hot scene safely. They need PPE, they need recognition. How do they recognize what the chemical is? They need detectors. Detectors are difficult to make, and you cannot have a detector that's going to find every single chemical. This is why they must rely on recognizing set of signs and symptoms. We call that toxidromes. And I, as a toxicologist, would not be able to memorize every clinical effect of every chemical out there. There are millions of chemicals that can be poisonous. So what I would recommend is all of us to focus on studying toxidromes. And by doing that, we're able to start managing a scenario safely, efficaciously, until we get more information through proper diagnostic tests and the proper detectors at the time. So the major toxidromes that you want to think about, Of course, vesicants is what we are really working on here at UAB, as well as vomiting. And then we have the cholinergic, asphyxiant, caustic, the tear gas scenario, and of course, those other miscellaneous scenarios where somebody can, for example, become comatose, like we saw in Moscow when the Chechen rebels were subdued by the Russian special forces who released in the ventilation system an unknown chemical that we think was an ultra-potent opioid like carfentanil. Actually, it killed all the rebels, the Chechen terrorists, but it also killed 20% of the hostages. So not an ideal situation, but again, recognizing these toxidromes is one of the few things that you can do as a responder or as a physician in the first couple hours of receiving these casualties in your emergency department. We recognize that in the US, and the National Library of Medicine has provided us with tools that we can use to help us identify a toxidrome. And this is the CHEM website, CHEMM website. It's a free website, downloadable on your phone, and has the Chemist tool, which is the intelligent syndrome tool recognition, toxidrome recognition tool, that you can enter different physical findings and signs and symptoms, and will give you an estimate of what this toxidrome is most likely to be. At the hospital level, again, we have the same challenge. We have to recognize the illness, and we have to provide the supportive care that's necessary, and hopefully we have more antidotes or countermeasures in the pipeline that we can use at the right time for the right patient and improve the outcome of these victims. This is why the US has really been invested in this process, and the NIH CounterACT program is a perfect example for that. It is my honor to be involved with this. When Dr. Athar and Dr. McCormick mentioned the opportunity for me, I almost jumped off my seat, or fell off my seat, if I may say, because it's a unique opportunity for a clinician like myself. I'm not a basic scientist. I'm not, even my research is not groundbreaking, but what I do is education, and I realize the importance of what the scientists do for what I do. And I also realize the importance of public health, talking to the scientist, talking to the clinician, because the three of us together, we can do a better job tackling these insurmountable challenges. But I have full faith and confidence in your team and your center in getting us to that stage of our preparedness. And thank you for your time.